lose the position, or otherwise. But that requires a lot of personnel pressing all across the front line. There's already an inherent
Oof.
problem where they didn't have enough men, where if there was a break in the
This
line,
might
they
not
didn't have
work.
enough men to flood those breaking points, to flood those holes with men, to kind of turn it into a general break in the line. They already don't have enough men to do that. But there's also a question of whether or not they'll have enough men to maintain that pressure. And going into
Hmm.
2026, the recruitment numbers that I'm hearing about are not numbers that see the army expanding. But when you listen to how the government in Russia talks, they talk about continued expansion. And so, if they can't get the men to fight the war going into 2026, they'll have to find either other ways to get the men or other ways to deal with the war. And the other ways to get the men, like
Uh,
pushing people into service, using
oh
conscripts,
no.
using private conscriptivage in an offensive military capacity, is not popular. The only time that we saw support for Vladimir Putin really dip the entirety of this war was when they were pushing people out for service and pulling up the conscription lists and that mobilization campaign that they attempted. That was the only time that we saw Putin's numbers dropping by like more than double digit margins to like a actual net negative scenario polling wise. It's hard to say because you look at like the horrific piles of bodies, and I'll look at these drone feeds when I'm out in the front, and you'll just see pile of body there, and you're like, oh, look at that guy trying to crawl over his friends to get to a position, and you think to yourself, God, why does he do it? Why does he do it? Why does that sad son of a bitch continue to crawl over the dead corpses of his friends? What? A couple $1,000 down payment? But it's fucking for how much a month? What is he doing it for? Is he doing it for love of country? And you try to think at some point it has to break. But the truth is, nothing lasts forever. I think sometimes people talk about the Russians in a way as if the Russians are immune almost to societal pressures. That they've been through so much and they haven't peeped too loud. So obviously you could take the entirety of their youth and throw them against bayonets, and the Russian mother will say, "Do you need another child? Let me produce one for you." But then if you look at the Russians like that, you're looking at the Russians like an alien
Oh my
hive
god.
mind, less than a society of oppressed
Uh.
people. That's not to say that they won't play along with empire building, but that is to say that all people have their limits. It took 10 years for the war in Afghanistan to really bring back the pain at home for that intervention to end for the Soviet Union. This has been at a much faster and hotter burn, and it's been for a smaller population than the entirety of the Soviet Union. So you would think that it would be faster, that speed, but it's also a different country, different
Hmm.
environment, different context for the war. The connection between Ukraine and Russia is more significant in the minds of people living in Moscow than the links between Moscow and Afghanistan. I guess my point is for your $10 donation is that while on one hand you can look at the amount of death and destruction that the Russians have already put themselves through and say, it seems that at no point will the Russian mind cave to saying this is too much. But you could also say that for 4 years for the Confederacy, or for Bashar al-Assad, or for any other number of struggles and causes and wars where the cost eventually would actually become too much. Not to mention, all I'm talking about right now is public support for the war, not the actual financing of the war. And public support for the war can change once your pension is affected, right? I know a lot of elderly people. This is really sad to say, but I think I know a decent amount of elderly people who'd be much more comfortable funding a war if they got to keep their pension than if they didn't. If one scenario was fund the war, no pension, the other one was, don't fund the war, you get your pension. That decision for most of them, though, would be quite simple. So Kupiansk is in a special city.
Wait a minute.
I don't know if you were asking me to say, is Kupiansk the special city by which shall slaughter Russian Empire? No. But that wasn't Stalingrad either. It was just fairy tales. Financing defenses is never funding a war. Well, it seems to be when we talk about it in America. Anyway, where was I? Yes, I was talking about this Financial Times report before I got asked if Kupiansk was the fucking magic city on the... I wasn't trying to imply that Kupiansk was special. I was more thinking, why would the Russian government bother lying about it? Because the Russian government is fighting for axis of advance and attack. They have times right now, and I still the amount of loss of men, the idea that we could use that as leverage. Like, the Russians would never accept part of Russia's occupied by they're going to have to either take it back or negotiate. You use it and say, hey, step out of Sunni, step out of accept that you're not going to take XYZ during negotiations. So hey, Dense Pixel, thank you so much for the significant because more pressure could be applied on Kharkiv, but it's also southward. Region generally, and more pressure on the city on Ukraine in northern Donetsk, Kramatorsk, positions that still exist around Krasnodar, Constantinople. mentioned that it's not a problem, but if it was a problem, it is not a problem. Now, 4 hours later, I spoke to a lot of people. There were troops, but they were generally got further than they expected. That they expected to either get with more resistance or to be pierced counter. To say that they didn't have to get through tank trap and barriers and stuff like that. But that is to say that I want to say the resistance was not minimal, but it was significant to know that it was still and then they could expand their holdings across the board. What it became undeniable, the way it got communicated to people first was refugee. Was people from the Kursk region fleeing deeper into Russia, cities, sharing their experiences on social media. Have not been reimbursed for their homes being destroyed. Even if they go back there, all they see is destruction and evidence that the whole thing happened in the first place. Point is, and it became undeniable. At least in Russian command. Why? The reason it denied the truth is such an embarrassment for Russia. It was such an embarrassment for his administration, and it was an embarrassment for the state. And when it comes to Gerasimov is somebody who managed the very start of the invasion, but he was not somebody who had the state invasion. Gordon's gone. He was removed from his position as defense minister, and he was replaced with somebody he stayed. He stayed as this commander, and he continues to manage the war. In fact, not only did he stay, not because he's better than troops, he's obviously only marginally better in comparison to the disasters at the start of the war. Probably a lot of other people around him that have mostly improved. When Shoigu and Gerasimov was yelled out of the mouth of Prigozhin, who marched on the capital in that thunder run we were discussing earlier, it was in order to go after Shoigu and Gerasimov. It was